So, welcome everyone. Sorry for being late a little bit. So I was thinking about, so the immediate goal, this is our second meeting? Third meeting, okay.
You did the political, remember, and the opening, and a little bit about Aristotle.
So our goal, given the sort of the exhaustive and overwhelming nature, the density of Aristotle's prior analytics, the goal, at least I was thinking the goal would be to just touch on some of the fundamental points in like book 2 and book 5 today. Just to sort of set the terrain without becoming Aristotelian scholars as our immediate goal, but just to set the stage, and then next week we can do 6, just touch on 6, 7, and 10, or 6 through 10, but for next week. But if people want to read ahead in the actual prior analytics, I forget what I wrote on the original reading list, but it's the first
that's easy enough.
4 or 5 sections of the prior analytics. We're only interested in the syllogism, basically, in the prior analytics. So if you want to read ahead, the goal is to sort of start with the categories and then shift to sort of a discussion of the syllogism. And we can just look at the first figure, the perfect figure of the syllogism. And then, so that would be the 5th meeting. So next week we'll probably begin the discussion of the syllogism. So
do you have the schedule by any chance?
I
have to send it out because what happens...
It's on the website.
What happens here is that I think we have a hiatus, and we could always meet somewhere else. We could try to do that. I mean, I don't know where, but maybe I could, arrange for something, on a Wednesday.
And we'll have updates on our website.
Yeah,
like
we'll have
a
updates.
change of venue or change of
because we're going to
class.
lose 2 weeks, I think, in this class. So it'll be a 3-week interval.
3-week interval before we...
So we should have at least one of those classes, not to make it
some other location,
in some other location.
So please watch the website.
Yeah.
We'll announce.
And I'll send out an email too.
Yeah.
We'll do these.
You won't be staying at this place?
Can I make an announcement before you go on, vis-a-vis this class too? Badiou, I mean, it's going to be hard to get there, but he said next Monday night at 7 o'clock at the Miguel Abreu Gallery downtown, and he's speaking on the dialectic in politics, affirmation, negation, and the affirmative part of negation, which is both an Aristotelian problematic, as you well know, and of course the Hegelian problematic of the universal.
That would be amazing.
Particular.
I hope I can
So
attend.
he's giving that. I suggest it's a very small gallery space. And last time I went, there were 350 people outside and in sub-freezing weather around the block to get into a space of 80 people. So if you're going to go, you should be there at 5:30.
Can you leave maybe people who are interested?
I'll leave this.
Just the address, because I have no idea where that is.
It's Elwood Street on the Lower East Side. Abreu is very well connected to the New Orleans, he married, I know his ex-wife.
The Maison Francaise announced this, too.
Yeah.
They announced it.
Yeah,
it would be a great opportunity to hear, a great French philosopher, live.
I know
One of the greatest thinkers probably who's currently alive.
Well, this is really about the labor of the negative, which I'll certainly go over in the Hegelian in the Hegel class, and you'll certainly touch upon.
So the goal is
dialectic logic. So
So today we're going to sort of engage through book 2, especially book 5 a little bit. Then it's important next week to talk about the negative and to talk about the relatives or relations, because Aristotle is the first thinker in the Western philosophical tradition who introduces the notion of relations and relatives. Already in his discussion that something is in something versus something is of something, you already have the relational setup. When something is in something, like the color white is in Socrates. That's not an essential part of who Socrates is, of his being, because he may not be white, or he may be less white if, he went to the Mediterranean and sunned himself, or whatever, right? So, chapters 10, 6 through 10.
Which chapters of the categories are you covering?
So right now, today we'll focus on chapter 2,
Two.
book 2, and then book 5. substance, primary substance versus secondary substance.
2 and 5.
Today, right? So the 4 categories of being, and then the notion of substances, basic and secondary. And then books 6, 7, 8, 9, introduce different categories. For example, quantity, quality, relations, negatives. And that would be enough probably with Aristotle. So that would take us through week 5.
6 through 10, right?
Huh?
6 through 9, and it's just
10 as well. 6
right.
through 10.
All right.
But I mean, we'll just sort of introduce markers. And then I'm hoping that by week 6, we can engage with Hegel, sort of Hegel's notion of the syllogism, which is a development of Aristotle's in a very major way. And then that would take maybe at least 2 or 3 class meetings, and we can read Ilyenkov, the Soviet philosopher's sort of interpretations and clarifications of, and expansions of Hegel's notion of dialectical logic. And then in Hegel, of course, we'll see the notion of negation, we'll see the notion of contradiction. These are all intensifications and developments and massive rewritings of Aristotle of the categories and the prior analytics. And then probably that could take us the rest of the 8 sessions, unless we get lucky, and then on maybe the last session we get a chance, or the last 2 sessions we get a chance to read and discuss David L. Harvey's article, which reads Hegel's logic, Hegel's syllogism, figure of the syllogism, and Marx in Capital Volume 2. And then that would be kind of a nice way to finish the 8 weeks. Maybe we can meet for a 9th time also, just to finish things. And then next semester, I propose whatever we can't finish today, we just continue. So next semester, we just continue, start with Hegel, and then continue with Marx, and as just those 2 thinkers in an 8-week course, for example. And then really get into greater detail. Because with Hegel and Marx, I feel we can do more. With Aristotle, it's very difficult because everything is so terse in the logic works. Everything is so short, and so, because these are lecture notes, and so it's almost like we have to rely on the accumulated Talmudic kind of interpretations and commentaries that people have written over the centuries of what he's talking about in Book 2 and Book 5, for example. Okay, so that's basically the immediate roadmap.
Well, I mean, it may help, in a more generalist sense, to look at this as part of the organon also, which included the book on rhetoric, on interpretation, right, as well, the book on topics, then the sophistical refutation. So this all makes up his logic, and then of course there's the metaphysics and then the writings on natural science and all this. So it's good to kind of, put this, that the categories themselves are a part of the organon, it's not the full organon. And it's very training, discipline and punish.
So the reason why I thought we would read this rather than the metaphysics, for example, of Aristotle, or some of the works you mentioned, is that in these works we have the clearest exposition that other philosophers pick up, like Hegel. Hegel, in the Minor Logic and the Science of Logic, engages exclusively with the primary logics. Okay? And then because Hegel does that and reworks Aristotle's figures of dialectical logic, Marx, of course, does his work building on Hegel. But that's absolutely true. This is an enormous systematic corpus that we probably still haven't digested fully. If we read it with an emphasis in dialectical logic. Okay, so I've been thinking about this question, for various reasons, and it just seems that our ontological state is such that human beings, we want to know these answers, like what is the purpose of life? What is the purpose of existing? Why do we die? And why is that necessary? Why is that part of our fundamental experience? So we want to know the answers to these questions, but when we attempt to answer them, we can't really get answers that are necessarily very satisfying for various reasons. But yet we have the ability to ask a question that is truly unanswerable. And to me, like, in a way, personally, this is how I differentiate between the great fundamental philosophers from maybe, if you want to call the second order philosophers of lesser importance. Because thinkers like Aristotle, for example, he's exclusively and overwhelmingly in these works interested in sort of obtaining somehow, grappling, feeling his way, and trying to understand, what does it mean for a human being to exist? What does it mean for the world to be? What is the world? What does it mean to exist versus what does it mean to not exist? That's the fundamental distinction between what is true and what is false for him. He knows he's not going to be able to answer this question conclusively, rationally, right? Through reason or through some kind of logic, but he has to ask the question. And I think to me, this is the fundamental starting point of dialectical thought. And in some ways, when Hegel has that wonderful quote when he says, I'm paraphrasing again from last time loosely, to be thinking means to be really sort of suffering through the tensions of the contradiction that you're struggling with, between life and death, or between a political decision, or between some other fundamental decision that is expressed through a contradiction. And I really think the greatest thinkers really deal with asking, deriving, formulating, and asking fundamentally unanswerable questions. And they ask the question because they have to. Because otherwise, something in their sort of inner core is making them push the envelope. And if they get far in arriving at some kind of an intermediate answer, that introduces profound changes in human thought. And I think this is sort of one way maybe to make sense of a classification, categorization of philosophy itself, So for example, an analytical philosopher could come up with very refined and truthful answers to ways in which we think or we are or we are not. But they formulate questions that can be answered, rationally, beyond a reasonable doubt. That means the question is not fundamental enough, because the fundamental question is truly unanswerable for. So I think that's one way I think to approach dialectical thought. The constant push to answer something. You'll get an answer, but it'll uncover another side of the answer which is not really true anymore. Or in the process of answering or deriving an answer, you've also uncovered its falseness. And then that continues the movement, until you reach these spirals in Hegel. I'm not saying that you have like infinite loops of truth and false, but I think that's probably, Marx would probably agree, or Hegel would agree, that you can't have absolute truth, because there's always this movement, of thinking. And I think this is what Aristotle is sort of introducing, this kind of attempt to ask the fundamental questions that are not directly answerable, but he's going to try to answer them by breaking down the fundamental questions into simpler questions, simpler atomic sentences that have subjects and predicates that are clear in meaning, may expose certain more slippery and fundamental truths about our condition, human condition. So if we want to sort of go through some kind of outline, maybe we can just start at chapter 1 and just notice that in book 1, these are really books, right? Because of the scrolls, they had at the time. I don't even know what kind of ink they used to write. That's kind of an interesting sight. Aristotle, by the way, this is kind of a fun trivia. He never got Plato's position. He kind of, when Plato died, he was rejected because he wasn't an Athenian. So he did not assume the chair of philosophy, so to speak, in the most prestigious.
He was 20 years.
Yeah.
20 years.
And he was clearly one of their greatest
and he
thinkers.
went off and founded his own, and then he came back to Athens.
He
and
was
founded the
rejected by whom? By what?
By the local departmental committee.
The academy, the people, the students of Plato.
Because he was a foreigner.
Yeah.
He was a foreigner. He was not an Athenian. He was from Macedonia, you know.
His father was the doctor to the government.
So he had
of
a found,
Macedonia.
he founded his
So if
own-
Aristotle can't get to be the chair of the department, you know, I mean, come on.
Not worth being the chair.
Did he come back to Athens after Alexander conquered?
Well, it's debatable, apparently. I asked him, apparently it's debatable that he was a tutor of Alexander the Great. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't.
No, he dedicated 2 works to Aristotle, to Alexander.
Yeah.
He was a tutor for a very
effectively
short
state
period of
philosopher
time.
of Alexander.
Well,
More like a private tutor.
it was
Like
a
you know.
tutorial.
That's the difference.
Yeah, it's true.
If the monarchy is also his environment of his
Yeah,
empire,
yeah.
then
Yeah.
he's private tutor.
But he advised him on empire building, if you will.
What
you know,
city was he
If
from?
you will.
Sure.
You're right.
What city was he from?
Which says a lot about Alexander the Great.
I don't know the
Sense,
exact
right?
city,
Great.
but he was raised by his guardian.
That maybe that he, or maybe that was a common thing that
He wasn't
rulers
Athenian.
did at the time. They
No, he
had
wasn't
these sort of
Athenian.
courtly
Yeah.
philosophers that would
Yeah.
it's
We
function.
still do today, in a way.
Or today as well.
Yeah, we have the centrist thinkers.
The-
Habermas, he's like a good example of state philosopher.
But it's true, and so in fact, when he came
Well,
back,
here he would be a radical. To Germany, he's a state philosopher.
How is he a radical here?
No, because given who our state philosophers are, the Straussian school in Chicago and other people like that. Habermas is much further to the left of, the Straussian agency of the Chicago School, which were the counterpart to the Chicago School of Economics,
Right.
and the Committee of Social Thought during the.
Oh, the Chicago it's already
1970s.
depoliticized the whole philosophical discourse, actually.
look, Chicago. I mean, this would be a sort of a side conversation,
Yeah.
but Chicago does have important thinkers who are conservatives. It's true. I mean, Gary, you can watch the Gary Becker lectures on human capital,
Yeah.
and they're interesting. I mean, I don't necessarily agree politically with his notion of human capital, but it's a very powerful intervention, if you will, maybe indirectly into the notion of capital.
Becker's an economist.
It's a
He's
serious
political
A
economist.
very serious thinker. Foucault
But-
engaged with Gary Becker.
Strauss,
Foucault read Gary Becker
Strauss,
seriously.
who considered himself to be sort of apolitical and just a major reader of Greek texts and an interpreter. These are people that denied any importance to the French Revolution.
But they were
And they
serious
were a very
thinkers.
conservative elite
Yeah.
that took control post-World War II of the departments of philosophy, as well as taking control of a whole generation of people that were ex-Trotskyists, as well as, the whole, Dissent magazine, commentary, Potterots, all these people became part of a kind of Straussian network that influenced the project for the New American Century of Bush. So when I made the comment about Habermas, had a very radical beginning, theory and practice, if you read the early work, Knowledge and Human Interest, are attacks upon instrumental reason. I mean, he may have become much more to the center later, right, in communicative action, but he did start out, in
I mean,
his
I just
notions
want
of the
to just to
public
end this
sphere.
kind of
Yeah.
just to sort of
Yeah.
frame it a little
Yeah.
bit even
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
before we go back.
Right.
I mean, if we're going to talk, it's good to talk about the connections. And for example, what was the German Nazi era legal theorist Schmidt? Carl Schmidt, who
Yeah,
in
of course.
America is read as a conservative thinker. From the point of view of Martin Heidegger, the most important conservative revolutionary philosopher in Germany at the time, Schmidt was a liberal, right? So it's kind of interesting how you have these kinds of divisions, but he was a liberal for a very interesting reason, and that's something we can sort of put aside for later. But Aristotle didn't get the chair, so he came back and created a parallel institution of higher learning. I just find it funny that the battles that exist in academia over high-profile teaching positions, nothing's new. It existed in Aristotle's days. So, in book one of the categories, it's methodologically speaking, one of the interesting things for me is Aristotle's sort of style of writing. Of course, this is not his writing in the sense that these are lecture notes that a student wrote down, but the fundamental methodological point that Aristotle uses in teaching, in trying to study and understand complex subject matter, is the process of diaresis, the notion that you study and you understand the complex whole of something. What is politics? What does it mean to exist? Or what is an economy? Or what are the reproductive cycles of sheep? Because he studied sort of animal biology as well, was to break it down into simpler parts. So in this kind of line of thinking, which of course is the contemporary scientific method as well, right? In other words, if you try to isolate, I was reading an article about Ebola virus. I'm sure you've heard, but there's been a major breakthrough in the treatment of the Ebola virus, and the death rates have gone from 95% to less than 40%, because researchers have invented 2 vaccines that are apparently much more effective. And how did they do it? Well, they went through progressively sort of simpler, more abstracting, isolated ways of studying the virus and how it affects the human host into more and more compartmentalized things until they reach the level of microbiology and the cells and the DNA of the virus, and then they're able to work backwards and create the vaccination. But if we want to graphically or represent something, if this is the complex whole of something that you're interested in learning, you're never going to be able to comprehend this if you try to capture and attack and interrogate the whole thing as it were. For example, if you're interested in studying the politics, Aristotle says in his Politics, you have to break up the political into its constitutive parts. So you have to identify the parts. And then but you have to identify them correctly, right? And once you do that, you sort of have these kinds of processes where you reach an intermediary stage, and then you reach a more, and as you move from here to here, you are moving to more fundamental or essential things that are really part of and make up the thing that you're interested in studying are on this level of analysis. The more particular, the more individual level of the thing, rather than this level, which consists of ultimately the functioning of the more specific and smaller scale, if you will, and more individualized things, right? So if we call this sort of the letter X, I don't know, just to indicate the whole, of course, consists of, multiple instances of X's, for example, and Y's, and so on and so forth. So this is the most fundamental level, and this is the universal level. We're going to get into this when we do chapter 2, but just as a way of and this is the more, if we sort of label this would be the individual. This is the word that Aristotle uses, but we could also use the word particular, which is confusing because when we do Hegel, for Hegel, this would be the level of the singular. In the latest translation in English, is the singular, I forget the older translation in Hegel, I think it might have been individual, particular, and universal, right? So these come from Aristotle. Except that Aristotle doesn't really have, in this discussion necessarily, something called the particular like Hegel does, but he does have it, right? Remember, this would be the genera, species, and the individual. So it's a triad, right? It's a triad. So for Aristotle, the most fundamental level, the most important part of, for example, of what does it mean to be human, is displayed and is perceivable and is understandable if you focus your analysis and you ground your analysis on this level, right? Of course, this participates in this, and this is not possible without this. They're already related in some kind of a necessary relationship. So this is how Aristotle studies everything, right? And this is one of the great contributions to human understanding is the method of parts to a whole, which lives on today in everything we do, in scientific method, and also in that kind of logic, Cartesian logic, and so on and so forth. So, I can make copies of this. One of the interesting and useful things in studying Aristotle is that there are multiple accumulated sort of almost biblical, Talmudic kind of interpretive levels, that people have done over the centuries. And one of the diagrams that I'll share, maybe I'll redraw partially, is this, but in more detail. So in book 1 then, without getting into detail, this is the beginning of this process of classification, right? So in other words, this is literally a philosophy or a method of classification. Of classification according to function and meaning, right? It's a very carefully thought out way of trying to piece together the puzzle of life, if you will, starting from and grounded in the individual human being, right? Who is always understood to be in a complex relation with more and more general levels of collectivities of humans, right? If we focus the discussion on humans. But you can study plants this way, you can study animals this way, you can study colors this way, you can study any object that you are aware of in the world by forming a classification, right? Grounded in the particular, in the individual, and noticing its relationships on this scale of the universal to the individual. All that implies, when he talks about synonyms, for example, homonyms, synonyms, you can almost see this in the language. There's an attempt to immediately establish ways of classification which can capture difference and similarity. Difference, similarity. Belonging, not belonging, right? He must have been a brilliant teacher, because these are sort of the fundamental building blocks of logical thought too. Later, when we have the propositions, two propositions and a conclusion, two statements and a conclusion, these are the starting points of that. So chapter 1 of the categories is beginning the discussion which is going to terminate in the very beginning of the prior analytics. So for example, just to read it, when things have only a name in common and the definition of being which corresponds to the name is different, they're called homonyms. Example, right? Thus, for example, both a man and a picture are animals. They have only a name in common. Next, when things have the name in common and the definition of being which corresponds to the name is the same, they're called synonyms. So you have the beginnings of how we can differentiate something, and at the same time how we can establish identities with things that appear different, right? Book 2 just continues. We don't need to spend too much time on this, because I think the next section of this is where we should spend more time. Book 2, of things that are said, of things that are talked about, of things that people know about. Some involve combination, while others are said without combination. Examples of those involving combination are man runs, man wins. And those without combination, man ox runs, wins. Now this is an interesting methodological point here too. Now why is Aristotle bringing this distinction? That sometimes when we talk about things, we refer to things only by using a single descriptor. Man, fire, red. And other times when we communicate, we create combinations of things when we describe things. Of course, this becomes important because now he's starting to establish the difference between something that is universal and something that is individual, right? Or particular in some translations. But he doesn't tell you that in the first paragraph, right? The first paragraph is just sort of like, look, first we have these basic distinctions, and then, in other words, here's a simple distinction that we make when we use language. Next section, 1.820. Well, let's add more complexity to that distinction from the previous paragraph. So this kind of pedagogical method of writing, you know. I think this is very important because personally I've witnessed in my life, you know, in academia, you know, and I am guilty of this too. Like I try to write a paper about something, and then I immediately start categorizing. You know, I'm going to discuss this, I'm going to discuss that, but I just sort of throw it out there, already fully fleshed out. And it's like, and Aristotle's like, wait a minute, if you're building concepts, you have to do it very carefully, starting from less meaningful distinctions, and then establishing clear parameters of how you talk about things, and then you add in layers of complexity. So it's a good way, it's a great way, it's a great example of how to develop concepts, you know, of thinking. Many people do this in science too, like if you read Newton's text, developing calculus, or if you read any of these thinkers really at this level, like Leibniz, monadology, it's all these same thing. Like it starts with clear little concepts that are easy to grasp, and then stuff is added to them, stuff is added to them, stuff is added to them, and by the end, you know, you have something that says a lot. Okay, so now let's go into, just basic distinctions. Can I erase this? Does it work? Yes, okay, good. So, just definitional things. Now that in book 2, first paragraph, Aristotle has made the distinction between, now that he has introduced ways in which humans communicate, right, in a certain sense, you know, some things we refer to simply through single word. Other things we refer by stitching words together, right? So he's essentially saying, okay, well, we're going to focus on language, you know, how humans stitch sentences together in order to understand not just directly what the sentences mean linguistically, but also what they say about our ontological condition, you know. What do they say about the relationship between beings? And beings here, of course, in a general sense. You know, ox, lion, human, a rock, you know, something that is red, right? In that sense. Then he's saying, let's talk about sentences. And here, I just want to sort of introduce a basic outline. Because Aristotle uses these words, which have, of course, become fundamentally important in the study of political philosophy, in Hegel and in Marx and many other people, the notion of the subject, right? Although here he doesn't mean it in the way we would say today, a political subject, right? But perhaps the functioning, this is sort of its ancestry. The Greek words, I mean, I'm not going to make a big deal about it because I don't, unfortunately, read Greek. So we can say it's, you know, hypokeimenon.
Well, I mean, hypokeimenon in the literal sense means the underlying substance.
Yes, so we'll just use the English translation. Yeah. That upon which something is grounded, or that upon which something is acting, or that upon which something else becomes possible or
and
visible.
And also that which can be subverted.
Ultimately, yes. Yeah, absolutely.
This is really where it goes, I mean, politically. You know,
but on the simplest level, the least useful level, a subject is what a statement is about. If you want to stick to the linguistic level, right, which is not very useful, but again, simpler to more complex. And then we'll do what Michael said.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, we're in really propositional logic at this point.
This is the logic of classification.
Classification.
Propositional logic. We can say this on the side here.
Right.
The main concern is
Right.
propositional logic. A way of classifying things. Part of the reason, because we communicate through language. And so this is what we have to work with, Aristotle implies here. We got to use language to understand how we make sense of the world. So a subject then is on a basic kind of linguistic level, what a statement, a sentence that says something, right, obviously, a statement is about. And then let's do the secondary and more essential definition that Michael said. And Michael, you said subject also has connotations of a ground.
Or an underlying.
An underlying.
Underlying to the substance. Underlying the substance.
An underlying.
To the substance. A hypokeimenon is an underlaying, if you will, the underlying thing of the substance or of the thing itself.
That which is the thing itself.
Yeah.
In other words, this is our focus. Our focus is the subject. That's us, ultimately, right? That he's interested in. Because this is a materialist philosophy. This is different from Plato, right? This is a philosophy that prioritizes the human being as the center and sort of the ground. I mean, your teacher had very beautiful, Rainer Schurmann, the great German philosopher who taught at the New School for many years. One of your teachers. He has very beautiful sentences about this materialist tradition in philosophy, which grounds. He has this beautiful translation of Heidegger development. He says, human beings are essentially defined by three relations that begin from them and end with them, right? So to, near, or for oneself. So this is sort of like another way of saying that the fundamental point of a materialist philosophy is that it's fundamentally interested and prioritizes human beings, understood socially, right, within the context of social life, not in abstract individual units, as the fundamental and most important concern for us, because we're understanding ourselves, which is the most important thing. And by the way, we should mention this, science has it easier, because science does not study us. A scientist does not study oneself. Science studies oneself through another object that is non-human, usually, right? So that's fundamentally an easier task than doing this kind of philosophy, which attempts to understand what we are, or I is, or am, because there's no possibility for abstraction. You can't abstract yourself to understand yourself. You can't put yourself in a test tube. I mean, you can try, like a contemporary sociologist might do, who's a positivist, and do surveys and this and that, but then they have to control for bias, and it's not very satisfying. Because there are layers of ideology that, the questions are the inherent vagueness of language, and it's very difficult, right? It's very difficult. You can mathematically define human beings and what does it mean to have collectivities of human beings. You can do set theory, like modern political science, and I graduated from the University of Rochester in 1993-7 as a political science major, which was a pioneering school of positive political theory, which is essentially the counterpart to neoclassical economics and rational choice modeling. We did math. We did bad math. I mean, we were not mathematicians, We did kind of set theory, game theory, and it is fascinating on a certain level. And I remember the professor defined the U.S. Congress like a legislature. He defined legislature using set theory. Let X be the set of all, and then there are certain conditions. And there's a lot of work to go through the math, but you get very little returns. You're like, in English, you can say it very simply. Congress is a collection of elected representatives, and then you can describe something. Language is much more powerful when you describe human interactions. Now, you can use symbolic logic to also describe certain things that humans do, like you do in economics, which is very useful, But the great economists don't do, pure math in this kind of abstraction as well, right? So they use statistics and other models, but anyways, so a subject then is what a statement is about. This is a sort of, if you will, a linguistic notion, or it's a determination, or that prioritizes a linguistic reading of the word subject, and this is an ontological reading. Remember, Aristotle does both at the same time when he's studying whatever he's studying, being. Okay? And then, of course, a predicate. And of course, this here, the Greek word for me, as a non-reader of Greek, it is very obvious as well, even to me, is kategoreumenon. So that's where the word category comes from in English, right? So predicate means to classify, to order in meaning. That's how I'm reading it. To order in meaning what you're saying in the sentence. This is what gives meaning to the sentence, to your communication, to your engagement with whatever you're trying to convey. So the predicate.
That which is predictable.
That is what?
That which is predictable in the sentence too.
Okay.
Yeah, also.
Or anticipated logically,
Exactly.
or in an obvious way, because we're humans and we understand, so that's an ontological reading too, right? That which is predictable. That which is predictable in its meaning. We'll give an example shortly. We'll have 4 examples to clarify this. That which is predictable in its meaning in the course of reading, writing, or saying the sentence, or hearing it, for example. In the course of engaging with the statement. The statement that you are, whatever you're saying at this moment, you're going to predicate things in order for the other person to understand you. Right? Now, a linguist might say, well, that's trivial, of course, duh, that's what language is. Aristotle's saying, not so fast. I'm not only interested in the linguistic notion of, what parts of speech or whatever. He's saying, I'm interested in the meaning that is understandable to another human being when you say Socrates is human, or versus Socrates is wise. These are 2 different meanings. The linguistic sentence analysis is very simple. These are simple sentences. But the ontological, what this means, what does this sentence say about the relationship between the subject and the predicate may not be so trivial. But it's obvious to humans, because we understand these things linguistically, or even more importantly, ontologically. We understand the meaning of what you're trying to say. We don't care about the linguistic part, right? Unless we're linguists. Nobody cares about the linguistic rules unless you're a linguist, but we care about, what did he say? What did Michael say about Heidegger? Really? Right? By the way, I gotta say this, the Heidegger lectures are great. Michael did a series of Heidegger lectures 2 years ago. They're on our page. Because I was listening to Professor Dreyfus's lectures, University of California, which are great. But your reading is different.
Yes.
And I think it's worth sort of, if you're interested in Heidegger being in time, Professor Dreyfus, it's famous, he died recently, I think. Famous lectures on Heidegger's being in time. But Michael's course was, I think, in many ways more interesting. Without detracting anything from, Dreyfus, of course. So a predicate, that which is predictable, or that which emerges or that which points our attention to the meaning of what the sentence is about. Right? That's the ontological reading of what a predicate is. The simple, more linguistic definition would be a predicate is what a statement is about. What a statement says about its subject. A predicate is what a statement says about its subject. So, in sort of graphical representation, you have something like, you know, if you will, there's this kind of a basic relationship. You know, this is how we build a bit. So let's do some examples. Let's see. Should skip. A human being, I'm going to try to stay close to, a human being is an animal. I mean, yes, we can qualify it as also an animal. A human being is an animal. If you don't like this, Socrates is an animal. Right? So obviously the subject here is the ground, the thing which gives what the sentence tries to convey meaning about is, of course, Socrates. So this is the subject. And this is, of course, the predicate in this case. Again, though, right? Because humans, this sentence might carry several different meanings. Socrates as an animal might sound to 21st century ears as saying something like he's a partier or something. Right? But Aristotle, of course, means it here in a different way, right? He's saying, as we'll see immediately in the next paragraph, that, or we might as well say it now. So what is the meaning here? Is that Socrates, see, on one immediate level, yes, is this true? So let's ask this. What is Socrates? Socrates is an animal. Is that a fact? How do we know whether that's true as human beings who are educated about the world and animals and human beings? How do we know that this is a true sentence to say that Socrates is an animal? Is that true? Yes, because Socrates is a human being, and human beings, in the classification of mammals, right, is ultimately, if you go further away from humans and up into the various species and genera, is a type of an animal. How do we know that? Well, because we know what animals are. We have classifications of the animal kingdom, you know. So this is an ontological interpretation of the meaning of that sentence, right? In other words, it basically says Socrates, right, is a specific and very precisely denoted instance of an animal. A human type of an animal. Not just that, an individual human with a name, Socrates, who's a philosopher, right? So this sentence behind itself hides, if you will, or includes this entire movement from the individual person, Socrates, that you were referring to as a historical figure, the species, Homo sapiens, for example, and then the genera. The simple sentence. This is what Aristotle, I think, wants to point our attention to if we want to capture what human sort of, how we can sort of derive understanding of the relationship of being in this particular sentence. Yes?
How, maybe I'll get to this later, so you don't have to answer me on this now. It's distracting. But the question is, how does this approach prevent absurdities? Like if I were to say a human being is, or Socrates is a peanut butter sandwich.
All Greeks are zombies. Socrates is Greek.
If Socrates,
Therefore,
if you say,
something like this.
Yeah, that's absurd.
if you say Socrates is a peanut butter sandwich, ontologically we can ask, what is Socrates? Socrates is a human being, is a peanut butter sandwich. On a level of just basic understanding of Socrates, clearly Socrates is a human being. He's not a peanut butter, right? So in that sense, he would say, first of all, the first thing he'll say, you're doing a more complicated predication because you're not classifying two things that are of the same type. See here, we're classifying the highest level, a genera. We're classifying a type of this genera. So this is kind of a type of a classification, which is a specific instance of a broader type.
Gotcha.
class,
However-
if you want to use the modern language. Now, if you're doing Socrates is a peanut butter sandwich, you're mixing two things from two different
Right. That's what I meant by absurdity.
genera or classifications. or
However, in
cat-
the world
yeah.
of commodities and capitalism, it's not so absurd. You're gonna have Socrates peanut butter in the world of commodities.
I mean, yeah, we
You're
have,
gonna have a sandwich at a Greek diner, Socrates peanut butter.
That's
So think about, I mean, you know, how when you know, what happens when you begin to transform into this, you know,
Yeah, this is-
I've
absurdist
never had the
world
notion of-
called, you know,
of
late
pejoratives
capitalism
or
or
bad
whatever.
gossip or something like that. Like in the notion of jokes or something like that. Like if we say, if I had another joke that, you know, aligned all idiots or peanut butter sandwiches, and then we just go Socrates peanut butter or something like that, how that, you know, because it could still work logically. But I see what you're saying, it doesn't work.
see, this is, to me, this is the trickiest part of the
Lewis Carroll,
Right.
great example, Alice in Wonderland, who was a logician and a mathematician.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Like by
That's what I'm,
background.
exactly.
To me, the difficult part about Aristotle, and I'm also reading it with you. Like I do
Right.
not claim.
No,
any
it's
kind of-
just
I'm
right.
trying to read this with open ears.
Yeah.
For the first time, if you will, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because there's so many things written about these people. Sometimes it's hard, and you have to start reading as if you're reading it for the very first time, and see if you can.
Totally.
But I think what we're doing, and Arto's really good beginning with his propositional logic, is that this is one form of logic that
It's
he's
one
dealing
form.
with.
It's
You're
dialectical.
also demonstrative and then dialectical logic, which are other types, which will, you know, come back in to this elementary form called propositional
We should
logic.
say this right here.
Yeah, which is
Aristotle's logic,
Yeah.
from the point of view of logicians today, is outdated.
It's form.
It's only of historical interest to students of philosophy. This is how it's approached in most university departments. This logic, we haven't even reached his syllogism, but Aristotle's syllogistic logic has been superseded. It held true as the sort of the grounding of logical thought in Western philosophy until the 19th century, when the German mathematician Frege introduced a new logic, which has superseded Aristotle and solved problems that Aristotle's logic cannot solve in terms of formal, mathematicized logic. But I think that has a very different ontology that's not useful to the study of politics. It does not engage with dialectics the way we do Aristotle does. So that's why I personally am completely not interested in it. Because to me it seems, it's much more complicated, it's much more profound in its beauty of like formal structures. I just don't feel it's very relevant to the way humans actually are. I've talked to people who are mathematicians and we've had these debates, and I'm not a mathematician, but yes, this is outdated, and to me, it's not simple. It's very complicated because there's vagueness and because he's trying to capture how we work, like how the vagueness of human communication.
The whole history here is laid out, of which true false statements are built, validity and invalidity and argument. All of these things are coming out of this for many, many years.
It's overwhelmingly
et cetera.
profound.
In the 19th century, as you rightly put out,
This
is
is formal logic, right? As opposed, can you use that term?
No, not really,
Vague.
because, I don't think he would consider it.
We would call it
formal logic.
early. Maybe,
Yeah,
one way
it's
perhaps we
kinda
could
hard.
call it as an
It's-
early
It's
version of dialectical
It's
logic.
different. Oh, really?
You said
It
propositional
is
logic.
an early
propositions.
form of.
This is
not-
proposition.
It's not dichotomized with.
It's an
with-
early
with-
form of dialectical logic. Yeah. That's how
Or
Hegel
morph,
reads.
But it lends itself am I right or wrong? It lends itself to theological thinking. That's why Thomas Aquinas.
Well,
was
he
such
was great. He
why
was a
did he
great
make-
dialectician.
Why did he
I
make
mean,
such?
you know,
He was a dialectician.
Yeah, he was.
You know, the great Catholic-
Then I'm off.
Yeah.
No, but
I
Al,
mean,
that's true.
he
The
was.
great Catholic theologians, the great, Aquinas, Augustine, these were great thinkers. They were clearly,
So they will
they spent their whole lives immersed in
with this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a whole school of kind of obscure
Look at
Neoplatonic,
Yeah.
Neo-Aristotelian philosophers in like early Christian period who engage with this, Arab philosophers in the Arab Renaissance.
Dante
Just look
called
at this.
Aristotle the master of those who know.
Yeah.
That's the great quote
The
of
master.
Dante.
Right.
Aristotle is the master of those who know.
Right.
Yeah, the master of those who know.
But when you bring up Aquinas, you can see this at work. You can see the propositional and the demonstrative and the dialectical all working in the sections on objections, proofs, and refutations in the Summa Theologica. So it's not like dialectical logic just started with Hegel and Marx, right? It has a very long history here in terms of form, as you say.
This is where it started then, right?
Yeah, this is where it started, yes. Right. Well, dialectic, and I hate to do it, but etymologically.
We're not there yet.
Means
We're like weeks
the two
away.
in conversation.
Yeah.
This is
The
the
art of
preparation
conversation.
to the initial formulation of the initial question in its
Proposition.
introducry form. This is like, by the way, you just signed up for a 10-year class.
We're children.
This takes 10 years minimum. Like you can't. When I was in graduate school, when I was in graduate school and I was a major in political philosophy, we studied none of this.
Yeah.
I mean, I read it in undergrad, and I read it on my own, but we didn't study this. Can you imagine? And
Hegel was mastering this at 13.
we read other thinkers who were important and very interesting, like we read John Locke, but John Locke read Aristotle. All of them understood this stuff, right? But we did not. So it's kind of, for me personally, this is a quest to sort of emphasize that if we're studying political philosophy, we kind of have to start from here and account for these people. Instead of starting directly with more advanced or later on people, thinkers, who already assume that you understand these distinctions, like all of the major figures did. Okay, so let's just go on. We'll do as much.
Plus, he passed all the tests of what it means to be a good philosopher. He was run out of town, so
Yes.
he had to leave. He had to leave Athens.
So a human being is an animal. So this is the subject, of course, and this is the predicate. You can say this particular color is red. Right? So what would be the subject here? You're interested in, right? You're interested in learning, you're conveying some meaning about a color, specific color. What's that meaning? Well, you're saying that this is red. This color is red. However, it's interesting because color can also function as a predicate. So subjects and predicate can switch. Right? So you can, for example, say something like humans can construct a sentence that say red is a color. In which cases this is the predicate and this is the subject.
We used to call that predicate nominative. I mean, years ago, studying grammar, when the subject was the same as the other part,
Yeah.
we called it predicate nominative, analogous or whatever to. They don't study grammar anymore.
That's when the public schools were much more
Think
rigorous
about
now.
Lacan and
I never
psychoanalytic
studied that in
theory and linguistic shifts in all of this. The interesting thing is, in the 19th century, the neo-grammarians are picking up on this in the most banal form. And along comes Ferdinand de Saussure, right?
I'm sorry,
and I'm sorry? Yeah.
Ferdinand Saussure.
De Saussure, comes along and does the course in general linguistics, which puts out the proposition that language is a differential system, part of the differentiae, without positive terms. Everything's canceling everything out. And this is an attack on the neo-grammarian, which opens up the whole structuralist project. So this is very interesting the way this then becomes, taken up, by, Hermann Pohl in the neo-grammarian school, the Lockean school that he referred to earlier, in the sense of linguistics. And I'm reminded when Al talks about, nominative predication was the term he used?
Predicate nominative.
Predicate nominative, yeah.
So,
Right.
in other words,
So this was all the way we were taught, which was a very undialectical way because of the influence of these kind of neo-grammarians. And the dialectics and the tensions in language were never really forced out.
well, these are,
Right?
in other words, this is an important
So
point
I'm
to make that
riffing on
one
this.
other way
I'm sorry.
to to read what Aristotle is trying to
Right.
bring to us here is that he's saying there's a tension in language. There's a certain tension when humans communicate through language that has actual meaning. Now, you may call it political meaning, you may call it ontological meaning. I would call it political because Aristotle said that the political is the most fundamental part and most important part of the human experience, if you will.
Master
And
science.
it's the master science,
Book
and it
two of the
grounds
ethics.
everything else.
Yeah.
Right? So he's trying to squeeze out and show us the tensions that exist in language. For example, some things may function as a subject or predicate. For example, the word color here. In this sentence, this particular color is red. Color is the subject. In the next sentence, red is a color. Color is a predicate, not a subject. However, there are other things that can only function as a subject and never as a predicate. For example, I can't say, Arto is a Socratesian or something. Or Arto is Socrates. It makes no sense.
Yeah, that's right.
Why? Later on, he gets into this. This is an individual determination. This is a particular reference to a specific human being, and so is this. So this cannot function as a predicate to this, because see, this is interesting. Grammatically, you may say, "Oh, Arto is Socrates." If you read it literally, Arto is Socrates. Somebody will be like, "Oh yeah, he has absorbed Socrates' method of teaching," for example. But that's like a simplistically, reading. If you stay with on the ontological level of engagement here, you're mixing things that don't mix in meaning. Because Socrates already means something specific. Socrates is a reference to another particular human being that's well defined within a particular border of being. It's a historical figure, in ancient Greece and so on and so forth. I am not Socrates. It can't work like that. Right? Just like you can't say anything that is particular reference, anything that is a primary substance, as we know. These are primary substances. This is a primary substance, this is a primary substance later on. Anything that is, we'll get to this later, but anything that is a primary substance cannot function as a predicate. Right? So there are interesting things that come out of these simple initial examples. So now let's do this a little bit more just to illustrate this last point. So let's just use two of his favorite sentences again, right? So Socrates is a human being. And then the second sentence is Socrates is wise. Do these sentences convey the same meaning about the relationship between the subject and the predicate? That's what he's asking, right? And this is sort of where the conversation becomes interesting for him. In other words, are they identical in their conveyed meaning about the relationship between the subject and the predicate, which is another way of saying about the relationship between the being of the predicate and the being of the subject, right? So this is sort of where this is how he wants us to think.
We called wise back then, I don't know if they, predicate adjective.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's valid.
No, I'm sure these are sort of. I never studied that.
You're too much neo-grammarians, Alex. They messed
Where did you go to high school?
Back in the 7th grade, we had
Public high
to make diagrams out of long,
Yeah, of
complicated
course,
sentences.
of course.
Today, they wouldn't even be able to.
Just think if Aristotle had the concept of Homo sapiens, he wouldn't have to have the two sentences there.
So there is a difference for Aristotle, right? What is the difference, would you say? It's an ontological difference. Grammatically, they're identical completely. One has a subject and a predicate that obviously, they're two simple sentences. They have straightforward meaning. They're both true. Are they true? Well, wise is debatable, right? Depending on if you thought Socrates was wise. I thought he should have run away. He shouldn't have killed himself. But, you know, maybe that's what I would have done. Maybe that's why I'm not a...
Nietzsche said he was a suicide case.
But there is an ontological difference in the things that they refer to or the meaning that they convey. What is the difference? This, by the way, this is sort of like a way of approaching book 2, right? Where he gets into the 4 categories: set of, not set of, in something and not in something. So what is the distinction? The distinction here is that, what does this tell us? What does the predicate tell us about Socrates? It tells us something that is fundamentally, it exposes something that is fundamentally true about Socrates. It exposes, Aristotle would use the word, something that is essential to Socrates. It exposes a characteristic about Socrates that is the most fundamental characteristic defining that being, which is that Socrates is a human being. Okay? So this, if you will, this is...
When you say fundamental, do you mean that he could not be without?
Yes.
Okay.
The most important thing that he could not be without.
I
Because he could be without some other things, but this
So
is the
in
most...
other words, like,
yeah.
Socrates is a man. I'm a male.
Yes.
He could be still a human being and not be a man. Like, in other words, we didn't have to know that.
For example, if I say I'm a male, that's a great example, thank you, right? I'm a male, but I may decide at some point that my gender is fluid and I could transition to some other gender. But I'm still a human being, right? So, if you say Arto is male, 10 years later, you may say Arto is transgender. These may be both true, but they say something less essentially important about my being than saying Arto is a human being. That makes sense, right? It's straightforward. Mm-hmm. It's straightforward, but to me this was very moving. Like, this was a beautiful kind of way to talk about to classify things of more important and less important. More true, less true. More durably, completely true, if you will, to other truths that are relative, that may become false. Right? I mean, think about it. There are all kinds of interpretations here that become possible if you say Socrates is a human being means this sentence asserts a fundamental, essential truth, or in other words, if we don't like that word, we can say an essential aspect of the being called Socrates. Or the thing, if you don't like the word being, you can call the thing called Socrates. Socrates is wise does not. Socrates is wise conveys a true meaning, right? It is true. It says something that is true about its subject, Socrates. But it's less fundamental. It's less essentially necessary to fully describe or comprehend what Socrates really is. Because he may be less wise at some point in his life. Or he may be not wise at all based on a certain decision he made. He was wise, but that changed. That attribute, that quality of, which is another category, might change over time. It's not a permanent thing, a permanent descriptor that describes some kind of an unchanging, that's another way of saying fundamental, essential part of Socrates' being. He still remains a human being.
I mean, in the Kantian terms, people often talk of an opposition between the concept of necessary and contingent. In other words, yeah, I won't go any further, but could one say that in this same way? That it's a necessary, essential thing rather than a contingent?
We can use that because necessary to describing Socrates in the most truthful way, in the most fundamental way, right? He's a human being. Rather than...
In the most ontological way, because essential comes from the infinitive esse, to be.
Exactly.
Right?
Absolutely. And I know you know Latin, so...
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, Socrates is wise, we can say, he uses these words later in the metaphysics, essential and accidental, right? But again, when we read the categories, it's completely impossible to understand any of this without reading the metaphysics and so, or without reading the commentaries about Aristotle, because this was the early version, but it's the only place where he talks about the logic, right? In the metaphysics, there's no explicit mentioning of logical structures the way there are in prior analytics. So we can borrow words from Aristotle's later works, of which the metaphysics is, of course, the most judged to be the most important historically, by many thinkers, but these are Aristotle's words, essential and accidental. So Socrates is wise. This sentence tells us something that is less fundamental or less essential. Thus, it is accidental. Accidental, in the sense that it may be subject to change. It may not. It may be, and because of that, it is not always present as a way of thinking about it. Look, this may seem very far from Marx. But only if we read Marx superficially. I think that's my opinion. If we read Marx simply as a critic of political economy, narrowly defined, I think if we're interested in doing that, if we are interested in that, we're making a big mistake, and that's the surest way to oversimplify Marx.
Yeah, and just
or other non-Marxists, or reading, Heidegger or whatever.
Or just a psychoanalytical movement, especially around Lacan's rereading of Freud, when he says in a piece called Kant of Exod that the table of categories, which of course Kant is borrowing categorical logic and propositional logic and relational and qualities, all from Aristotle, sets up, anticipates all the perversions in the Sadian universe. So who would have known this little guy that's walking every day to this little, who had one relationship, would have in his table of categories all the perversions of the chateau, during, before the French Revolution, of the Marquis design. So, this is interesting. When you begin to really think it through, and I think he's on to, he's really on to something here with the thing about Marx too. How does Marx make categories? How does he make categories itself? How do we get these categories to begin with? What does it mean to be exploited? What does exploitation mean? What do rates of exploitation mean? What do, all these terms mean ultimately, in terms of, please.
I would say that exploitation is not a contingent,
Could be.
a contingent, say, social relationship, rather, as in a certain sense, it is an ontological category. Exploitation as an ontological category. Same as in saying in Kant of Exod that the Sardine citizen has a certain it arises out of a certain it's more of a Kantian imperative rather than that the Kantian category. I'm sorry, I don't know how do you
Well,
phrase
the
this.
imperative in Kant is about categories. It's
So
not just an imperative; it's a categorical imperative.
It's interesting. that we-
Again,
Yeah.
that's another thing too, which does change, constantly, the categorical imperative.
It's interesting that we're revolving around the word categories.
Yeah,
It is a helpful way to
Yeah.
make sense of things. How you categorize and how and why a certain categorization takes place is a fundamental concern if you're going to study something seriously, right? Whether you're doing philosophy or economics or science or whatever the case might be. So
Can I ask a question? So when thinking about exploitation, for instance, as an example,
I thought the wrong word.
isn't that not, it seems that exploitation is contingent on certain systems of social relations, and is not necessarily universal, because there could be potentially social relationships that aren't exploitative, or that we can set those up. So would that be like an accidental, as opposed to a essential?
So the accidental relationship would involve, like as we will, like later on, in book 2, with sections 1A20, when he sets up the 4 different divisions of being, accidental predication necessarily involves sort of cross-categorical relations. Like, for example, human and a color, or human and a quality. Like Socrates is wise is a cross-categorical predication, right? So in other words, you're not saying Socrates is human. Socrates is human. You're simply classifying Socrates under the more general category of species. Human,
Genus, under genus
Right.
first.
Whereas if you say Socrates is wise, you are predicating sort of a quality to a particular category of, which is, in this case, what he would call the primary substance, which is a particular human being, right? So in that sense, that's what's happening there. Okay, so we have time, I think, to really get into the most important part, which is the chapter 2, the section on something that is said of versus something that is in something. And I think that would probably be enough to give us enough ammunition to just go to chapter 5 either today or at the beginning of the next meeting, and then move on. But so we can say this kind of a conversation exposes for Aristotle the 2 fundamental relations, which in combination with each other produce 4 permutations, which in this version of the text, at this point in the text, are enough for Aristotle to explain beings as they exist, right? So this is sort of like an initial fundamental categorization, which is section 1A20. Right? So this is book 2, 1A20. We have 2 fundamental relations. And the 2 fundamental relations are something that is something, right? Something. It's the thing that is said of a subject versus something that is in a subject or not, right? So that's how you have 4. Something is said of a subject, or something is not said of a subject. Immediately you already have the concept of, in a certain sense, opposites, right? I don't want to say the word negation because
I
it
would
functions
just add,
differently.
if I can,
Yeah.
the second
Yeah.
that you mentioned, it's present but not said of the thing.
Yes.
Said or
It's
said?
present, said.
Said.
S-A-I-D.
S-A-I-D.
S-A-I-D, yeah.
Sorry.
It's present already.
I'll write it
Go
on
through
the
the
board.
4, yeah.
I'll write it on the
Yeah,
board.
yeah.
Any question?
Yeah.
Said, not said.
Yeah.
And what are the other?
Something that is in a subject versus something that is not in a subject.
Your notion about not.
Not, one is not said, although it's present.
In a subject, not in a subject.
Yeah, they're
Mm.
right.
Yeah, go ahead, please, yeah, he's doing it, yeah.
So the
I just
first
wanted
one
to
is,
have
the
it.
first category
It's a
then
present,
would be,
present.
the first relation would be,
Relations, yeah.
again, I just want to emphasize the thing, something that is said. subject. And the second relation is something that is not, that is in. That is in a subject.
But
Here
not,
again-
but not said.
Huh?
But not said.
Something that is in a subject.
But it's not said, right? It's not expressed, right? Yeah. The second one, I'm just, yeah, unless you're doing something.
We can just leave
different.
it, yeah, maybe.
Okay.
The way he kind of presents it here.
I see.
Because if we go to the text, he just says, of things that exist, 1:820. Some are, then you have the letter A, some are said of a subject. Here the English to me, and this is because I'm not even though I've lived here most of my life, English is my second language, and I think this to me tripped me up, but I'm sure native readers were not tripped up by this. But here, the translation says, letter A, 1:820, of things that are, some are said of a subject, but are not in any subject. I'm sure it's clear to native speakers that when he says a subject, he refers to particular or singular, right? And then when he says, but are not in any subject, he refers to some other determination. Right? So this is clearer in some other languages. It's more, but I guess it's assumed in the English. Right? Anyways, we'll come back to that. So these are the fundamental relations that Aristotle argues are sort of very useful, are determine a lot of the sort of interactions or convey meaning in the relations between beings. Now, what is a set of? What does it mean for something to be said of a subject? Here we have to use again the words universal and particular from later on from the metaphysics in order to clarify. And I copied down some quotes that I want to read where Aristotle defines a universal, what he means by that. Okay, so again, for something to be said of a subject, so let's just expand these by writing them here.
Something that is said is the same as something that is predicated, or not?
Well, everything. Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely true. But there are different sort of permutations here that are. So, said of a subject. So something that is said of a subject, this is a relation of fundamental classification. What do you classify? You're classifying, for example, this kind of a relationship. You're classifying a type of a particular kind. Example, and this is where Aristotle's way of thinking of saying these things might be weird, so I'm gonna sort of present his way, historically the way he says, and then we can rewrite it simply by flipping it. So Aristotle's formulation might be something like, example, man is said of Socrates. To me, that's confusing, even though it's more accurate. So I just flip it. I just rewrite it by saying Socrates is a man. Now, my simple rewriting is actually confusing too. For a different reason, it hides the actual relation. Right? This is more accurate because man is said of Socrates. Means Socrates is a man. Now, why is this a fundamental ontological classification? We already did this, but let's do it again because practice makes perfect. Who said that? Maybe. This is a relation between a kind and a type, right? In other words, Socrates is what? Socrates is a human being. Recently I read that some startup in California has produced a new device called Aristotle that is a babysitter. You clip to your baby's crib, it has artificial intelligence and it listens to the breathing patterns, and if the breathing patterns are agitated, it produces soothing music, or it releases an audio recording of the mother, and they're calling it Aristotle. So I guess today, if somebody says Aristotle is a man, the objection might be raised, wait a minute, are you referring to the historical figure or are you referring to the divine? To Aristotle, this would make no sense, right? So when he says Socrates, he's referring to the actual person Socrates.
Yeah, Pascal, in terms of programming.
Pascal in terms of programming, yes. So this is a relationship between a kind and a thing that falls under it. So what falls under it? Socrates is a type in this case, and the broader category up, which would be human being or man.
In the Greek, by the way, it's anthropos, which is man. When he does this, I looked at the Greek. He uses the term anthropos. Because what we're doing here in some ways, it seems to me, and we can talk about as the course goes on, is there's an interesting dialogue going on between anthropology, philosophical anthropology, and ontology, in a different way. So we can keep that in mind. We'll keep this as an open tension going forward. The difference between philosophical anthropology and ontology. Ontology, the study of being versus the study of man. Yeah, right.
No, that's very interesting, right? That's very interesting, these kinds of parallel.
Yeah.
And he is doing this, Aristotle is doing this,
so
literally, right?
Yeah.
He's interested in being itself and trying to capture that kind of way of thinking about.
Right.
I mean, look, right?
So it's capital labor relations, basically an ontology, more of an ontology than an anthropology. We always talk about screwing the worker. That would be an anthropological statement, right, in some ways, right? Whereas if we talk about the relations of capital and capital wage labor relations, we're talking more on the ontological level of capital.
This already exposes
I'm just trying to...
Yeah, what kind of a richness you can derive if you do what Aristotle's doing and have a simultaneous analysis, if you will, of a particular social object that's analyzed ontologically and at the same time through philosophical anthropology. Or Gary Becker with his notion of human capital, you can read about this in the Foucault lectures if you want to see both sides most clearly, because I don't think Becker engages with Foucault, but Foucault engages with Becker. When Becker redefines capital as the possession of every human being, including every worker, has capital in themselves, and thus, right? So that's a major ontological, perhaps, attempt to redefine ontologically. And so, for example, if dogmatic kind of mechanical leftists would say, well, Becker is just sloppy, like what is human capital? No, that's a very serious attempt to redefine what capital is on the level of ontology.
Yeah, I mean, in Aristotelian terms, it's an interesting contrary to labor power. Right? This is what he's really saying. It's human capital. It's no longer just labor power. This is his way of using, I mean, he's not aware of this, but, he's using a contrary. Maybe he is. There's a lot of Aristotelians in Chicago.
Yeah. So, last time I held the class pass, so it's 8:25, so maybe we should stop.
We should stop about a little bit, about 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes.
Well, yeah, at 8:30, the guards would, because we're keeping...
No, about 8, you can go another 15 minutes, pretty easy.
Okay.
If you want, I mean, it's up to you.
Yeah, let's do just a little bit. Let's do just a little bit more.
Okay.
So, this is an interesting property, right? So something that is set up describes this type of a classification of a particular thing, right? And its relationship to its sort of more universal grouping that it belongs to. Right? So, for example, we could do something with, a lion is, a mammal. Same thing, right? Mammal is set of lions. So this is a type of a fundamental classification of type to kind. In other words, it establishes a relationship of meaning, right, in this sense. It has a few other interesting properties that these two things, man is set of Socrates, belong to the same category on two different levels. The particular or the individual and the universal.
Man here, more specific, well, I don't know, that's not right, means human being.
Yes.
It doesn't mean male, because
No.
that
I'm
would
just-
be another issue.
Yeah, I'm just using this because
Well, this was some kind of patriarchal society. I mean, I want to
Put
put
it
it mildly,
That, that's an understatement.
Would you accept, or would it get to the same a figure if instead of type you put example? Otherwise, isn't type an intermediate before the individual Socrates?
you're right, maybe there's a more precise way of
Yeah.
indicating the relationship. So you're saying
Split
maybe
it
instead of the
middle.
word type, we can say
It could say individual example, or you could say.
yes, an individual to a kind, or
Yeah.
to a individual to a class.
Yeah,
Maybe we can
because
do.
type
Maybe we can do.
Type implies that there'd be
Yeah.
more than one.
Yes, individual to a class.
Yeah, that would work.
Class of.
Does he use specific term in original?
He doesn't use. Depend again with the translations. I'm using this. There are different ways he uses. Usually it's translated in English like genera, species, and
differentiate.
individuals, or differentiate is
Differentiate is
another.
really what
yeah.
it is, yeah.
For the, where you have individual.
Yes.
Yes.
Differentiate is the term
Yeah.
that's used. You have a
I'm
genus,
trying to. Yeah.
Genus and differential.
Genus, species, differentiate.
species differentiate.
Differentiate.
Triad is Arto.
So instead of individuals, we can say differentiate, or we can
Yeah.
just say individual and a class, and maybe I don't know, we can come up with another meaning. Again, what is said of a subject, so here, just to review, what is said of Socrates is essential to Socrates. So again, man is said of Socrates, this predicate is saying something, or is describing something, or is pointing our attention to something that is a fundamental part of Socrates' being. Okay? It's interesting, by the way, because just to jump the gun a little bit, Aristotle calls this a universal. This is a singular, or individual. The universal predicates the individual. This is fundamentally important relationship for Aristotle.
Yeah, for him it would be all. And the particular would be some. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty.
So
All
the-
men are like, I mean, the classic example, of course, is, all men are mortal.
Well, that's the syllogism. We're building to that. Yeah, the syllogism is a more
Right, sophisticated.
sophisticated version. These are just the Lego blocks that he's
Right.
assembling to do the syllogism. But you have to suffer through this in order to get to the syllogism. Otherwise, the syllogism will just memorize the rules, which pissed off Hegel when he talked about all the Aristotelian students and professors of his day. He said they all memorized the logical rules of the syllogisms,
That's the syllogism.
but they didn't necessarily understand how they were arrived at, and that really upset Hegel.
Right.
What
Can you
is
imagine?
what is the Greek word for man? And
Anthropos.
Anthropos.
Onto, it means human being.
No.
That's
Well,
important. What does it
I mean,
mean?
it can mean human being, but it really
But-
literally
but-
is translated as man.
In Latin, the word for human being.
I just used man because that was the English, that was the word that was used in this translation.
What
That's it.
distinction are you making between human being?
Well, I'm not making a distinction, I'm making
Okay,
a
what is
distinction
being?
between anthropos and ontology, being and being in general. I'm making a
See, when we say
distinction.
being,
Yeah.
we're trying to capture the notion of being itself in general as a determination, and how do we talk about these
Right,
things?
right.
Whereas anthropos points out to a specific determination. related but different thing.
Right.
I mean, they're essentially two things talking about the same thing in a different way, with very vastly different results in meaning.
Mhm.
Before we end, I just want to read a few.
We'll go back to that.
A few
this
definitions.
is an important debate in the humanist, anti-humanist tradition
Yeah.
in both in Marx and post, quote, Marx studies.
Yeah, I just want to
Very
read a
important
few
distinction.
definitions of Aristotle's of what is a universal, just as a
Sure,
conclusion,
sure.
because this is probably a good place.
Okay, unless I missed it, you've only given us the aspect or the characterization of one of the four possibilities.
Right.
Yes, you're right.
Okay.
We're just on book 2.
We're doing
Oh,
building
okay, but
blocks.
you've got what is in versus what is
Right, but we
said.
haven't said much about it.
Yeah,
We just kind of put it on the board. We went through an example of it when we said Socrates is wise,
yeah.
but we only did a more expanded discussion of this so far, right? Look, we don't have to, obviously, we can never exhaustively cover in appropriate detail because we're trying to read these categories in a more, not just literal, we don't want to be Aristotelian scholastics, so we want to sort of derive more meaning that's connected and more relevant to us.
Arto
immediately.
Artinian is in BMCC as a professor.
Is the what?
But he is not of BMCC. This is another one.
We can make these
Yeah,
distinctions.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, you are somewhere, right? And it's said of you, you are there. However, you may not be of it.
In other words, so
Right.
then we'll get to this
Conscious
next
result,
part, but
yeah,
the
yeah.
distinctions here have to do with, is the predicate saying something about the essence of the subject, or is it saying something about that's part of the subject? You see there's a difference of emphasis. That's basically the main point here. But we'll say that again next time, the first thing, to make it more well presented. I just want to end the class by just offering what Aristotle said about the universal, because he doesn't say this in the categories. So in the metaphysics, he says, and we'll say this again next time as well, and as often as necessary, he says, now, of actual things that exist, some things are universal, such as the notion of a human being, right, or in general. Some are particular, or in our language, individual. Well, we can call this particular as well. I didn't want to use that, but he uses
I'm
it.
sorry, what is that word?
Particular.
Particular.
Now,
Individual.
I call universal, he
Not
says,
dividable further.
Yes.
That's what individual, not,
Yes.
not further dividable.
I call universal
I like
that which is
individual.
by its nature predicated of a number of things. And I call the particular that which is not. Man, for instance, is a universal. Why? Because by its nature, it is predicated of a number of things. Socrates is man. Arto is man. Alida is human being. We are, you're a human being. You can't do the reverse. You can't say human being is, right? The reversal does not function on the level of predication. For this is just what we mean by the individual. Now, what is the particular? The particular is the numerically one, as Al said. And by universal, we mean that which is can be predicable of the individual. This is all from the metaphysics. Of all the things which exist, some are such that they cannot be predicated of anything else truly and universally. For example, kleon, kalias, i.e. the individual and the sensible. But other things may be predicated of them. Right? So this is sort of where he's going next in this discussion of Book 2. And then, Book 5, 6, 7, 8, it just sort of like continues this distinction by giving different examples in different
The
ways.
Greek word for universal, katalon, from which we get the name catalog.
What is it?
Catalog. It's Katalon.
That which contains all the things that can be predicated of.
We get the word catalog from
Catalog.
catalog.
You can get anything you want in the catalog. Universal.
No, it's interesting.
It is interesting.
The way the etymological
Yeah,
plays
the
out
way
and
that-
the way that it
So I think maybe this is a good
Thank
place
you,
to stop,
yeah.
and then we'll just do
Yeah,
the
good,
best we
thank you.
can in terms of moving forward with,
We'll be to
with
the
the next.
particular next week, right?
So next time we should continue with
Please.
something that is in a subject with an examples, and then do the 4 categories, and maybe just, once we present that, we can move on to
Yeah.
maybe chapter
Since I do a
5,
little bit of
6.
the administrative work, I'll send out the email,
Yeah,
you know, where we'll meet because I think next week is a parent-teacher
It's a parent-teacher day in the
here.
school.
So we'll have to figure that out. I'll look at the schedule and we'll figure out a place to meet.
Arto, do you wanna give me that drawing that you made and I'll make
That's your
copies
pen.
for
That's
You
your
everybody?
want the drawing? Yeah, I didn't really talk about